And if you want to talk, you can please raise your hand. We will, and then we will acknowledge you. For safety reasons, as always, please note your surroundings and emergency exits. Those of you working at home should be pretty familiar. Those of you working in your office should also be fairly familiar, but it never hurts to make sure an ergonomic check, as always, is a good idea. And then we always want you, in case of an emergency, to call 911. And if for some reason that's not available to you, I would recommend the chat is available if it is a true emergency situation. Refrain from discussing any other proceedings in case commissioners are present to avoid inadvertent ex partes. So I'm going to go to the calendar now. Eric. So as you can see, we went through all our meetings. We had planned to discuss the various elements and to finalize the elements. And as was discussed all the way back in August, the next phase would be the actual testing phase. And that's where we'd be heading into. We're going to give you kind of a schedule of, this upcoming year regarding this on this aspect. So we are kind of in post-work group phase in the sense we are doing the testing, and then we will follow. Then we will have a report that we have to submit. So we will get to that in a second, or towards the end of the meeting. Next slide. And so we're just getting done with the step one. Step two, Eric and Daniel, probably Eric will be discussing the work plan proposal. Note this is a draft. This is a draft work plan. It's not a finalized work plan yet because we would like comments from you on it. Things we may can improve on, got wrong, or anything else that you think needs to be considered. And then we will take a 5-minute break, and then we can have a discussion. And of course, we can probably still have a discussion while the details are being discussed as well. And then we will go on to next steps, which will lay out when comments for this and other aspects of this working group that we will do, as I said, the next year. So from there, I would like to allow Eric to go on unless there's any particular questions about these preliminary items. Okay, Eric.
All right. Thank you, David. Yeah, so there's just a few items I wanted to go over that are in the work plan. I think a lot of these are really just clarifications on, some ideas that had been kicking around, throughout the working group, but we put a little bit more definition on. But there are, a few changes since, for example, what I proposed on the BNLI regression based on feedback. I think at the highest level, I think what I want to hopefully convince everybody of is that the two proposals we have are actually quite similar. It comes down to the ex post methods that are kind of different. But really what we're doing in the ex ante phase is, we've been calling them capability profiles. Josh and your team, you've been calling them time temperature matrices. We think these are, effectively the same thing. You plug in a set of, planning assumptions, a worst day temperature, something like that. That gives us our slice of day table. And it's really sort of this package of slice of day table and the capability profile that sort of is like underlying the slice of day table that the CPUC is going to approve. From there, we move into the operation space. This is pretty much outside the purview of the DR, of the QC working group. But there have been a few questions that came up around, right, like this idea of conditional bidding. So we did have some ideas on how we can move a little bit closer to that idea that I will share with you, and I think hopefully address some of the concerns that the CAISO had. And then it's really the ex post section where things really diverge, right? Those sections are pretty different, but then ultimately each of those results in sort of we've started calling it a performance rating to distinguish it from the performance alignment metric. But basically each says, as a % of your capacity commitment that's across all these different months and hours and sublaps and everything else, how did you do? And it's that sort of performance rating that is used to apply the capacity shortfall penalty. Again, I think both proposals are, pretty much the same, that will apply a capacity shortfall penalty. We've kind of put our preferred one in the proposal, but it's still open to feedback. So that's at a high level, I think, what I want to communicate about the proposals. So we framed the report this way too, that really the ex ante pieces are the same, and it's really, and the penalty section is the same. It's really a difference in ex post. And to that, on that note, I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between sort of time temperature matrices and capability profiles. I'm so sorry for the number of digits that are on this slide, but I think it's important to sort of have an idea of why we think these things are, more or less the same. So on the left here, I have, I hope most people on the call were able to attend Josh's, sort of workshop on demystifying time temperature matrices. I pulled the model results from example 1 that he gave. So Josh, thank you for doing that. And so basically to create a time temperature matrix, you're plugging in sort of every possible value and kind of coming up with all possible combinations or permutations, right? And Josh, tell me if I'm off base at any point. What I've done on the right is I've reformatted this. It's the exact same data into what I would call capability profiles. So for each sublap, this would be sort of what we'd call an aggregation. In our parlance, in this case, the aggregation sort of is at the sublap level, right? How this analysis was done is sort of all resources within a sublap are kind of modeled as one, and so we'd consider that an aggregation. And basically, we see it's a function of an intercept, which models will typically all have temperature, event hour, hour of the day, weekday, and then all of those variables kind of interacted with temperature. In most cases, these numbers are all the same across all the different sublaps. They're not sublap specific. That is not a requirement. That's just how this particular model was developed. And there's, we're totally fine with that. That's completely okay. Where it differs is sort of what the responsiveness is to temperature. And so basically what this allows us to do is to take any set of conditions in the same way that you might do to pull a value from a time temperature matrix, but plug in those values into this capability profile, and you get the same result. And I think why we tend to prefer this kind of format is because it's sort of easier to see what sort of the underlying sort of idea of the resource is, right? It's saying this resource is related to temperature, but it differs by event hour. Temperature, but differs by hour of the day. And yes, again, temperature, but varies by weekday or weekend. And so this is a fairly compact way to say, like, oh, these are sort of reasonable variables that we're using to predict capacity. And it's that sort of reasonableness determination that the CPUC is going to be tasked with, right? Does this make sense, or is this just a whole bunch of numbers and we don't necessarily know what to do with this? So I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions. Josh?
Yeah, first of all, I do agree, like the concept of the KPI profile and the TTM are very similar. It's easy once you have developed the model to convert it into a set of equations, right? Now the catch that I kind of have here is, like, I give probably the simplest equation you can come up with in the TTM that kind of have pretty good explanatory, in the example, have pretty good explanatory power. One of the things which I think is different in the TTM is the focus is on the outputs and really the ability to visualize those outputs if you want to visualize them. Whereas the model itself can be anything, right? So if somebody wants to run a model that is not a regression model, say it's a random forest model or a neural network, they can do that, right? Or if they want to specify a whole bunch of additional variables that are not included in here, because again, this is a very simple model that I put together in the example on purpose, right? They could do that as well. So I think like that's probably the main difference, right? So I understand like and I guess the question that kind of boils down to, is like how flexible are the capability profiles, right? Because as soon as you put in capability profiles, you're moving towards what are referred to as an interpretable model, really a regression model with coefficients, versus a whole bunch of other options that are available to develop the best predictive model you can potentially do. And then the second, and so I guess that's the question that kind of boils down is, are we narrowing it down and saying like, look, you have to use a regression model of some sort? That's question number one. And question number two is, how flexible will it be? Because effectively, once you built the model, then you would have to create this type of table, which is just a different way to show the same information in the regression coefficients.
Yeah, I think I'm, 90% on the same page. I think if somebody does want to do a neural network or whatever, that's fine. I think the key for us is that we want to get it back into a format that is sort of easier to analyze, right? And so, this is
but they're not going to be able to do that if it's not a regression. So if I have coefficients for regression, I can do this. If I don't have coefficients, which a whole bunch of like the machine learning and neural net models will not have that, you're not going to be able to do that. So by definition, as soon as you do this, you're requiring for something to run a regression, which is fine. If people want to do that, that's fine, because you could have flexibility in terms of what do you include in here and how you include it. The way I would deal with the TTM is I would say, show me your predicted versus actual, right? And show me that they're actually match up. And separately, give me the ability to visualize this in a variety of different ways to see how it varies by this dimension versus that dimension. And you could see that in the TTM example, right? Pretty clearly as well.
Yeah. I think the distinction that I would make is that, the TTM can be a useful tool for visualizing the data. But I think ultimately it's a more, it's not kind of the fundamental source of truth that we're looking for how a resource can perform. I certainly.
So let me ask you separately here, right? Because the benefit of the TTM is I can look it up and look up compare it to actuals directly, right? You can convert the TTM into a capability profile, but how flexible are you with here's all the various components of the equation, right? So if somebody came up with a different model, right? How flexible would it be to kind of accommodate like a completely different set of models or different way of modeling things? Because again, this is the simplest where you have like a single model, right, that did it all, and try to simplify it as quickly as possible.
I would try.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
I
sorry.
definitely tried to take your feedback on the original proposal to heart, which is that we were being, very, very prescriptive.
Yep.
Effectively to make the PUC's job easier, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think it's, we're absolutely open to, right? Like when we didn't even allow, say event hour in the original proposal, and here we're allowing both event hour and hour of day, right? So I think we're totally open to, if you want to add additional variables to this, go for it. But I think I guess where I'm sort of stuck on is like, we'd like the eventual output to be a series of like linear equations like this, right? If you want to use a square of temperature as one of your variables, I think that's fine.
Or if you want to use something besides temperature, you can do like average temperature. You can plug in and say like, here's the cumulative CDH over the last 24 hours. You can potentially do that.
Right. The purpose,
Yeah,
I
I think
think, is
so.
that
Go ahead.
staff doesn't really want to have like the full matrix for all different conditions. We'd rather be able to run whatever the equation is with whatever variables for the specific conditions that we care about. And so, as opposed to taking in the full time temperature matrix, um, having it in a format that is a linear equation or a non-linear equation, but with sort of flexible variables that allows
Yep.
us to do that.
Yeah, and you could do and sit here and say, look, here's like 3 different flavors of this that are recommended, right? Right? Because like, be realistic, like you might get like minor improvement by making some tweaks here and there. And that's a benefit, right? Because people are making an upfront commitment as to what they're going to be able to do. So having the best model to predict is useful for them. What this tells me is it's going to be constrained to like linear regressions, right? Which is a constraint that we just have to say, if that's a constraint that people want to live with, that's fine. And then the second question becomes, well, how much do you want to constrain the building of the capability profile, right? Based on the components that you put in there. As I noted in the time temperature development example, usually what you do is you actually hold a tournament, right? So you're going to fit in there and say, like, I'm going to try out a wide variety of different temperature predictions. I'm going to try a wide number of different models. So I might run through like 10 different weather variables that are predictive. And actually average temperature is pretty decent, but there's other ones that can do better, right? And you might run through and say, here's 10 different models that we want to test out, and we want to test out and identify the best one. So we kept the TTM example very, very simple on purpose, because the focus was on how do you simplify this and demystify that process, before we kind of say, here's the added components you add in there. So I'm hearing, I'm hearing it has to be a linear regression, right? So I guess the second question is like, how much wiggle room is there for giving you like a different set of equations if it's a linear regression? Because I'm picturing myself being in the seat of the folks at the CPUC. You have to operationalize those linear equations, especially if they're different from different vendors, versus having like, option 1, option 2, and option 3.
Yeah. So I think, ultimately we'll need to deal with like the formatting of this, but like we'll need a way to, apply, say, the planning assumptions to a set of linear equations like this that the PR provider is going to need to specify, right? And you plug in what's the average temperature in each sublab, then separately, for event hour 1, 2, 3, 4, so we get all 4 values and everything like that.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, was that answering the question though, Josh?
That's the answer. You guys want to have a linear equation, right?
Oh, sorry, I'm losing you. Your mic is really soft.
Sorry about that. It does tell me that you guys want a linear equation, like a linear regression. It doesn't fully cover what's the amount of flexibility that's allowed, right? But I think that I understand where you guys are headed.
Yeah, I think something that would be helpful for us is to have an example of something this would not work for, and sort of what that would look like if you were to say do a random forest.
There's no equation with the random forest. That's the problem, right? So there you don't get an equation. You get the best predictive model. You get your breakpoints and the like. Same thing with neural networks. Same thing with XGBoost models. Lots of models that I don't know if everybody uses them, but they are becoming increasingly more and more used for predictive modeling. Because this is purely a predictive exercise, right?
I think, yeah, what we could talk about also is like in the case that you want to use something like that, like the issue is that the staff needs to have the ability to run, if it's a model. I mean, this is sort of a regression model.
Yep.
I mean, we would have to figure out a way to share like the model object and like be able to run that as like on our end. And so it would have to, as opposed to receiving the full,
All the predictions.
yeah, every
Combinations.
predicted, you know. So I think that's the constraint that we're working with, the flexibility in terms of what variables or what inputs you want to consider. You know, we're totally open to, you know, whatever input it matters for the resource. It just has to be run by staff later to do the comparison step.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I thought like the difference between the two, and you know, just kind of like highlighting this, right? It's like in the scenario of the capability of the equation, right? One, you have to have an equation. Two, if you get a different equation for different programs, that's actually an additional burden on staff. Whereas I think a benefit of the TTM, it's standardized, right? You have, here's what you get, you know what it is, you know what you deal with overall. And obviously there's ups and downs to both of those, right? The TTM opens up the flexibility, requires a standard set of outputs that can be stacked if you want to do it, and doesn't require staff in particular to kind of be able to dig in there and say, I'm going to customize for, you know, different set of equations for each program. You know, but it's really your preference because you're going to be looking at that. I do think the underlying requirement is to be able to understand, you know, is it a reasonable set of equations? And to me, that goes back to the whole question of, are you actually using real performance data? Number one. Number two, is your model actually developing a decent prediction of how it performs in practice? You know, and there's different ways to kind of tackle that.
Yeah. So I guess I've been approaching this from what I think I would like to review if I were going to do this, but you know, ultimately we're turning this over to the CPUC, so maybe just a call for CPUC Energy Division staff to weigh in if you know you think one approach or the other would be easier.
Right.
You don't have to do that now.
Yeah, I've been listening to the conversation, and you know, without committing to anything, you know, it's going to be. I think there's a trade-off, obviously. You know, if you have a wider, you know, universe of ways to estimate, then we get hopefully a more accurate QC. But the trade-off is, you know, that's probably not as simple as you said. So where do we set the trade-off between determining reasonableness, ease of determining reasonableness versus getting accurate QCs? And I guess it would be, off the top of my head, obviously for ease of use, I think the CEC version, the capability profile is an easier one to analyze. It would be interesting to know how much better you know, QC or these the TTM models can actually be, because if we're like off by a factor of, you know, 50% or something like that, you know, that's, you know, what probably would be a more ideal prediction, and that could be a problem. But if we're talking about, you know, fine tuning the edges here, then we have to offset that with what, you know, we actually have to do as staff. So I think, you know, go ahead, John.
So one observation I have, and again, this is not a critique, it's actually an observation, right? It's the capability profile gives you guys the ability to produce the calculation. You know, it has the added benefit that the average daily temperature in this example is 82.5. You can do that, or 82.3, right? So it does have that added benefit. But if I'm trying to do an assess reasonableness of something, what I actually want is that notebook I gave you guys for the TTM example, where it shows very clearly, you know, here's the analysis that got done, here's the visuals that represent what is underlying the patterns that we're seeing. here is the actual predictive model, and here's how it predicts at a sample. Because I will be looking at how well does this model actually predict at a sample as being the ultimate metric barometer for how well it performs. That would be me if I'm looking at the reasonableness of what somebody proposed, is that you actually look at, use real data. Do you have some explanation as to what are the patterns? And does your model actually do a decent job of predicting and aligning up with actual, predicting for actual conditions? That would be my take, my screen for reasonableness. To me, that the equation doesn't, you can give me an equation, but it doesn't tell me whether it's a reasonable equation. What it gives me is the ability to replicate the calculations, right? Not so it doesn't tell me whether it's reasonable. But that's just kind of like my 2 cents from a high level standpoint in terms of the way I would QC a model.
Well, I'm not going to say for sure that we are particularly concerned about QCing the model. Say, I mean, the whole point of this is that you kind of are QCing yourselves. That if you are not doing a good job of coming up with your number, then you are going to pay a price for it. And so it's really incumbent on you to do the best thing. And I don't actually know, aside from them being like wildly, wrong or maybe misrepresenting certain contract conditions or something, I'm not sure. I don't think we're particularly care with how you get the numbers, and so we're not going to be QCing any models. I don't think necessarily. Although we could, I suppose, and I don't want to say that for sure.
So what exactly goes into the reasonableness decision? I mean, like that's been the black box, right? What makes something reasonable versus unreasonable? If I give you a set of equations here and don't show you how I came up with them, how does that make it reasonable versus unreasonable?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think part of how I look at that is, the the incentive mechanism is there to sort of police these individual numbers. The responsibility of the CPUC is more to say, is this being calculated in a way that, like, when it's played out, reasonably reflects capacity, right? And so you can look at this, right? Like it becomes more about this sort of like equation or this kind of like the idea behind the model than the specific numbers, right? We don't want the CPUC having to go be like, oh, is 3.54, reasonable for the weekday value?
Is significant.
That makes sense when we're interacting temperature with these 3 different indicator variables, and that seems pretty reasonable. It does raise a question immediately about, well, what happens when event hours and hours ending don't line up? Right? Which hours ending are we going to show for the event hours? And so like that to me is what the CPUC's responsibility is going to be.
Yeah, because you can envision somebody says, look, I'm not going to give you an event hour dummy. I'll give you essentially something of a function for event hour that says, here's a decay function, interact with temperature, right?
Sure.
Which would be very different. I mean, I'm open to what you guys are thinking about, but it just kind of raises the whole question. I think the question's still there, right? What makes something reasonable? Because, if I get a set of equations, it doesn't tell me whether a set of equations is reasonable. It just gives me a set of equations. And how does that get determined? Because I heard, from earlier from actually a lot of third-party providers is like, well, why are you shaving my DR my capability? Can we have transparency? If we say we can do this much, why does the number get shaved or not shaved overall? Or is the goal here simply that the reasonableness assessment is simply a rubber stamp?
Yeah, I wouldn't quite call it a rubber stamp, but
I would say that the reasonableness, and obviously a lot of it would have to do with what the actual final outcome is and would be part of that. But it certainly would be, I could think of it having I don't want to say rubber stamp, but it's certainly going to be more leeway, because the whole point is that we don't, my understanding is the whole point is that we aren't going to be doing these kind of black box shit, that it's not up to us. Like you're the one, it's not, the reasonableness is going to be determined by your actual.
Yeah, you use with the
performance.
profile, you perform according to the profile. That's the goal. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to say rubber stamp because what if somebody starts putting in something that looks very weird or it looks like, I don't for some unknown reason that I can't see yet. There's a way to game it, which I'm not saying there is. I just say I think in many ways it could be close. And this is obviously not finalized. I'm just saying I can visualize it being like, very almost rote kind of checking off a few boxes that you provided the correct data, that you've, that they're within ranges that are, kind of expected, and and then maybe not much more than that, because as we say, ultimately you're going to pay the price, and we're not going to go back and say like, well, you need to, include a squared temperature term or something like that. So
Right.
Yeah.
So it could be very aspects of a rubber stamp, or it could be. I don't see it being particularly detailed simply because of the nature of what we're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, I think, just since we're not putting any prescriptive limits on what goes into the capability profile, I think that's why I want to say not a rubber stamp. Like you could imagine putting a capability profile together, and I use this in the report, and it's kind of a silly example, but it's like, what if I said I had, 10 extra megawatts on Thursday, but not any other day? Like that's probably not reasonable,
It could be real. Right.
It could be real.
Yeah, like for CNI, I can see that like some CNI processes will be like bi-weekly, right? Or they'll be like Saturday's different than Sunday. Yeah.
So the other sort of flip side of this, and I didn't put a slide for this, but then the PUC is going to assess the reasonableness of your planning assumptions, right? You can't then plan that the peak day is going to be, Thursday. I mean, you could say it's 1/5 Thursday, right? Like there's a 1 in 5 chance that it'll be a weekday that'll happen to land on a Thursday, right? So again, these are the questions that if we're not putting specific parameters around, that are going to have to be left for the reasonableness determination, at least as I see it.
And there may be just ways for us to like ask for summary statistics or summary information on what's being presented, aside from the actual presentation of what we need, but kind of also summary so that we can see like, where do you max, where do you min, and things like that. I just ways to do that. Or I could see it where we could say, okay, we're going to pick some random parameters. You could tell us what it would have been or what it would be, so we can see. I'm just saying there could be many ways, but we're not going to be. I don't think we're going to be sitting here, doing like T-squareds and things like this to see how good your model is.
Right.
We should probably move on. By the way.
Yeah.
Useful discussion nonetheless.
Yeah. I'm ultimately, I would defer to this one to the CPUC. So if you prefer one or the other, let us know. But that's our recommendation for the moment. So the other piece,
and yeah, definitely.
Can I ask, how would this handle the case where somebody wants to do this based on I have X number of nominated megawatts from my customers, and I want to apply effectively what's a performance rate to it? How would that be handled in the equation approach?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So imagine a situation where you kind of have, okay, well, I have commitments, right, from my customers to drop this amount of load in general. And what I want to show you is not the megawatts per se, but here's the performance rate, right? So like if I have 50 megawatts contracted via my customers, I can give you 48% in this hour, 52, or basically can give you 80% at this hour. And this other hour, I usually typically get like 95% of that value. So it's not necessarily like it's weather sensitive. It's effectively just kind of using the realization rate, if you want to think about it that way, that happens from your customers.
That's probably I mean, I don't want to get you far down this rabbit hole right now. It's very
Okay.
Yeah,
Let's
maybe
just-
if you can give us a numerical example of that to look at, Josh, we can take it into consideration. I think that would help.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
another, addition, and thanks again to originally Josh's idea. I just, originally when we talked about multiplying a capability profile or time temperature matrix by the number of customers, I was feeling a little bit uncomfortable that number of customers isn't going to work for all aggregators and resource types. But then it sort of occurred to me that it doesn't really need to reflect anything specifically. If you want to include just sort of an overall growth in your portfolio, I'm thinking of folks with really diverse portfolios like Leap. They might not want to say I'm going to grow by 10,000 customers and 16 batteries and whatever it is. But you might want to say, well, my portfolio overall is going to grow by this much. So I think hopefully that gives some flexibility to show growth over the course of the year without constraining it to be like a per customer unit or something. I hope this one's easy. I think everyone is going to like that. The next thing I wanted to address came up in conversation with Kaiso about, how does DR bid its like real capabilities in the absence of, what we might call conditional bidding. And I think we can get sort of pretty close. So I want to show this example of what I'm talking about. So let's take a long start resource with a 4-hour max duration. It's a program that's shown from, or not shown, it's available from hour ending 17 through 22. So it's got a 6-hour window it can get called in. But we're just going to show it in the middle 2 hours there, because that's when we think on a typical worst day, that's when this resource is going to get called. So basically what you can do under this proposal is let's take your capability profile, let's say, or TTM values from the hours that you're shown, and we'll bid those into the day ahead market. If you want, you can bid some other values into other hours. I'm not going to address those too directly, but that's ultimately not what you're going to be evaluated on from a capacity perspective. We're just going to look at, what you were doing in those hours with shown capacity. So now let's say you bid this at $200 a megawatt hour, just because I found a day with LMPs that this works for, on September 4th, 2022. It only hits that price for 3 hours. So hours 19 through 21. And so you'd be dispatched at that full capacity in those hours. Now, because you didn't get bid in the first hour where you had your biggest bid, this is sort of no longer an actual or an accurate reflection of what the resource can do. So it's only 6, 3, and 1 when you think you could have done 9, 5, and 2. So basically what we're suggesting is that in the real-time market, which you can submit bids, as I understand, pretty much as soon as the day-ahead market closes, right? You can just submit a bid for the time temperature matrix or capability profile values for those hours, right? So they're a little bit lower, maybe because cooling loads are slightly lower late in the day, but it's reflective of what the resource can do. So I just wanted to float this idea, because it did seem that this was an issue for some DR providers. And I know that CAISO really wants to see bids that reflect actual capabilities, which we know will change, based on the start hour of the dispatch, or at least in some cases. So I'll just pause there. Is that making sense to everyone? See Josh first, and then Luke.
Just a couple clarifying questions here, not comment on this, but clarifying question number one is that what people would be required to do is bid the hours, right? What that they showed in the in the slice of day for that month, but the actual amount would be based on the temperature conditions that are actually happening on that day. So they're not really bidding the slice a day table; they're bidding the slice a day hours.
Yes.
Table hours for that month, but they actually would say if the temperature's cooler, it would have a lower value. If it's hotter, they might have a hotter value.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
The other observation I have here is that the big question here boils down with people being able to adjust in the real-time market. But one observation I'm having here is that for BNLI, obviously, like what you bid in the calculation have to match, right? For the BAM and PAM metric, they're kind of independent, right? Because BAM is, are you showing up, the bid alignments, are you showing up in the market? The performance limits, are you actually performing based to what you told me in the capability profile? So for that latter one, would you simply be you're simply saying, hey, if you showed up in the market and bid in that day ahead market, what your capability is and did it consistently? Would there be any need to do to effectively the real-time market adjustments don't play a role in the BAM as far as I can understand it. Calculation.
Yeah,
It plays a big role in the BLLI. Yeah.
That's a good question. Let's see. Your observation is that they do play a role in BNLI. Correct. Because we'd be looking at real-time bids, which would include the 6 from the day ahead plus like an additional 3.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and you're saying they wouldn't.
For BAM, I'm looking. Are you showing up in the market right now? We'll be looking at the capability profile that you submitted, or the bid you submitted. Does it match their capability profile? And then independently, when I say, well, did the performance when you got called, did it match what you told me would happen if you got called for a 3-hour event starting hour 19 at whatever the temperature condition is? So like we're going directly to an assess performance, and we're assessing whether you show up in the market and are showing up for the hours that you expect you to show up in. So like the real-time adjustment doesn't really play a role as far as I can see in the BAM calculation, because it really is more about the visibility and are you showing up for the right set of hours consistently.
Right. I mean, I do think that is a good point, and I mean, it does occur to me that, it doesn't occur to me. You just pointed out that there's not really an incentive to do this under BAM and PAM.
Yeah, though there's a requirement to do this because if you don't do this, say it's an actual event, you're going to get dinged for it under the performance assessment metric. You don't get dinged for it in the availability in the bid alignment, because in the bid alignment, I basically did my job by telling you here's the resources I have for the hours that you for the slice of the hours, right? So I already did my job by showing that in the market. Now in the performance alignment, you definitely want to show up and show that 6, 3, and 1 if that's what you have in your capability, or the 9, 5, and 2 actually, if that's what you have in your capability profile.
Right. So
we're deep in the weeds, but I'll let you chime in.
Yeah. Yeah, Luke, go ahead.
Actually, I think I understand. I guess the question I have is this: if Eric, it looks to me that you're portraying that in this instance the shown hours are hour ending 18 to 21, but you would allow. I guess the second part I don't quite understand. So the hour ending 19 to 22, sorry, to 22, excuse me. That's an option for the resource, but because those are not the shown hours, then we're ignoring that? I guess I'm
Right.
not clear.
So in the day ahead market,
Mhm.
we would ask for bids that align with the shown hours.
Right.
And then the only reason that the sort of dispatches of different lengths or at different times would come in is if they're only dispatched for a subset of those hours, right? And in which case, this is the subset, 19 through 21. And we'd say, oh, but that's a lot less than what the resource could do if it was really dispatched in hour 19.
So in that instance, you would expect, I guess, so even though they were scheduled for 6, you would expect them to deliver 9. Is that what you're saying in this particular instance?
I think the request, at least where I'm kind of heading towards, is that they would bid in the hour ahead market, hour ahead real time, these values, right? They don't need to be dispatched, although ideally they would be, because this is probably the values that you're going to get, right? Like unless you're doing some like really advanced like partial dispatches of your resources, like if you just activate all your resources, your capability profile says you're probably going to get this. And so basically all we're asking is, can you reflect those values in, the day ahead or the real-time market? Does that make sense?
So, yeah, but I don't know if that's possible for every customer out there, right? So I mean, just taking back to the beginning here. So, with HE 18 to 21, they put in this bid strip here, 10-6-3-1, and then they're only picked up for the 6-3-1 in the day ahead market. And for Long Star Resources, unless I'm misunderstanding you, that's it. That's what they're planning for. And so this notion that they're gonna suddenly, that the resource is suddenly going to deliver 50% more megawatts in hour ending 19 with 1 hour of notice is just not, it's not fair, nor is it realistic in many instances.
Yeah, and let me try to address one piece of that. Sorry, David, did you want to weigh in before I?
Well, I just wanted to kind of, discuss, why this, the ability to do more is one issue, but I think there was also a concern about the time of it, being not being able to provide what you're awarded, and so being able to adjust that in the real time. And if I recall, it was a lot of it was the idea that you would have like 10s across the board between 18 and 21, but in reality you have that's because that's what your must offer is required, and therefore and correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but if you had to put 10, let's just say you had to put 10 across the board, but you really had a declining uh, profile, then you're going to get awarded 10 in hour 19, and you can only deliver maybe 9 or 6 or whatever, and then you would adjust that in the real time to get it more to indicate what you can actually accomplish. And that was kind of my understanding. And of course, it can happen with more, but my understanding was that there was this contingent kind of bidding, if it was the first hour versus the second hour versus if it was hour 18. And this was a way that you can kind of create this kind of contingent declining bid or increasing bid or, hunt bid or whatever by adjusting in the real time.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. But so I've heard this characterized a little differently than how you did, Luke. So let me just try and see if that comports with what you're thinking. As I understand it, in most cases, when a resource is, when a sublap goes, kind of the whole sublap goes, right? Like when a resource is dispatched there, they're typically all bidding around the same price and all resources go. So it's not that they were expecting only to have to deliver 6. It's that they were only expecting to deliver 6 if it was the second hour of their dispatch. If all of a sudden it becomes the first hour dispatch, they are very likely to get a much higher value, right? And so it's not quite as high as their original first hour dispatch, which was a little earlier in the day, maybe a little hotter. So it's a little bit lower. But if they, activate all of their, thermostats, let's say at hour ending 19 instead of 18, they will likely get 9 megawatts. So this
Right.
isn't about trying to update in real time. It's just about trying to reflect what was dispatched in the day ahead, if that makes sense.
Right. So first of all, thank you for explaining that in a different way. I mean, I understand that this is meant to reflect the kind of decay, if you will, in the load impacts, over the course of this 4 hour a 4 hour dispatch. But it's two things. One is that I don't think, and I don't want to bog down the discussion, and I'm happy to move on after this, but I don't think that this is all associated with or that temperature is the only factor out there that's driving this decay. For instance, like I think the most common example is, okay, you're shutting off all your air conditioning or something like that, or whatever kind of cooling related process, and that's gets you your biggest load drop in that first hour in the 18, and then your incremental then you slowly lose how much you can maintain through going forward. But there are other elements to customer load profiles that are dependent on the time of day, for instance, that outside of cooling, for instance. And so I just want to point that out. And then the last part that I'm still not understanding is whether or not there would be an expectation in this instance that the DI provider would update their bid or their dispatch in the hour ahead market, or in the real-time market, excuse me.
Yeah, I think the suggestion here is that they would update the bid. And I believe this is possible even for long start resources once they are awarded a schedule in the day ahead market. Maybe Kaiso can weigh in on that.
Assuming that's the case, I mean, I still stand by I guess my concern. Don't know if I'm right or not, but my concern that there are other elements that might contribute in this instance to the 6 being what it is at hour ending 19.
Right. And
Hey,
so just to be clear, that should be handled by the capability profile, right? If it really is all the same, then this is still all kind of true. It's just that they won't have to update the bid. They won't have to add anything else, right? If their capability profile here just looks like this, then there's nothing else that they need to do. Oops.
if it's not conditional, basically. Yeah. Hey, Luke, just out of curiosity, how easy is it from all the third-party providers you work with for them to update the bids in the real-time market to kind of say, here's the day-ahead bid, and we can go ahead and just update in the real-time market to reflect real conditions on a regular basis? Because that's really the underlying question. Is what's the level? Is this something that's easy for folks to do, or is it going to be challenging and be burdensome for folks to do? Because there's an underlying assumption that folks can just go ahead and update it pretty easily, and they have dedicated staff that can handle that.
Right. I'm not in a position to answer that question, so I would, ask any of the DI providers to, to speak
Yeah.
up. They're available.
I was going to say the next 2 hands I saw were from DR providers. So why don't we go to Elysia?
Thanks. So I would say give me some grace here, just because I'm still learning a lot about like how things work operationally. But I think one of my concerns with this would be is for like a behavioral demand response side of things. Like I feel like you get a better response when you're notifying people with a day ahead, like, hey, you're going to have a DR event coming up tomorrow at 5 p.m. And I don't know that you would get the exact same response if you are asking customers to respond behaviorally in the real-time market based, like, I don't know, like, would the capability profile like reflect a difference in response based on like a real-time ask of customers? Or yeah, I'm just not sure about
Yeah.
that. And I would be concerned that, expecting the same thing out of people, giving them like 15 minutes notice versus the day ahead notice.
Yeah, and let me try to explain this a slightly different way. Like these capability profile values, these are all determined as if it was a day ahead dispatch, right? If you did have a dispatch from 19 to 21 in the day ahead market, because that's when you bid in, this is what you would be able to have. So the idea behind real-time market sort of like participation is not that we're going to wait until the hour ahead market begins to dispatch these customers. It's that we are going to tell CAISO what we're already expecting to have, right? Which is if we tell all of our behavioral customers a day ahead that they're going to have an event starting an hour ending 19, we think we're going to get 9 megawatts, right? And so all we're doing is saying, okay, when it comes time to bid into the day ahead market, we'll update it with that number. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. I don't know enough about like the operational like back end of like, is that something that's easy to do? I would assume so, potentially incorrectly, but I think, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. How about Noor?
Yeah, so I just want to maybe just repeat to clarify what the expectation is. So today, basically, with RAIM, I mean, let's just say it's an average of this. So you like have to bid 4 megawatts in 5 hours, and whatever is dispatched is dispatched, and depending on what the contract is, what if you're in DRAM or an RA contract, you'll be assessed accordingly. And without that construct, you can bid a variable amount, whatever your capability is for each hour. So the expectation is that you would bid based on whatever your showing is, what your response would be if you were dispatched in your first hour of your showing, right?
Right. Yes.
And
Through the entire duration of the showing.
yes, yes. And then depending on, and if you don't get an award, then you're not required to bid in real time at all.
Exactly. Yes.
And then if you only got like an award for 1 hour, you would only be required to bid in real time for that 1 hour.
Right.
But you would change, but you would, and the way this is constructed, there's no reason you would submit a decremental. There's no reason you would need to submit a decremental bid, but you would submit an incremental bid. If you didn't get dispatched for the full window, you'd submit an incremental bid to reach what your expected capability would be, if given that award.
I think that is correct. I think there are some instances, there could be some instances where you could be in a position to submit a decremental bid. So for example, I showed, and I just made this up, not required, but if I bid a little extra in the hour beforehand and I was dispatched in these hours, then maybe I would no longer have 10 megawatts.
Yeah, well, I mean, that raises an interesting point of like what is the must offer if you reduce your bid during your shown hours because you got an award in an hour you're not shown in.
Right. And
I think, Nora, I think that's a conundrum, right? Because reality is, if I'm the operator, I want to have the flexibility to call the resource earlier if needed,
Yeah.
right? And at the same time, from a capacity or capability showing standpoint, if I'm in the RA side, I want to pin you to a specific set of hours where you're going to, so I can count you when I do this, the stacking of the resources towards that. But there are those cases where basically the CAISO has called events. 2020 jumps out because there's a whole bunch of hot days there. But a lot of the actual events in the more extreme days happen before the typical window, and they started earlier. So I think that's the conundrum, right? And there's kind of like, you have the capability. The way the market allows you to bid doesn't actually allow you to reflect the full capability. So you're kind of having to do this dance, right, of trying to say, well, trying to show you what we have, trying to align it with the RA, but at the same time, you want to see the resource outside of the RA. So I think it's just a
Yeah.
trade-off. I mean, I reached a
And that's,
conclusion. There's no perfect solution.
I mean, I don't know if that's something that CAISO would want to send a market notice about what hours they want more if there's that kind of potential emergency outside of typical periods, but
That's
that
interesting.
is
That's interesting. The shown hours would sort of serve as the default, but if the CAISO said, "Hey, everybody, if you have availability, please bid, starting hour ending 17," could
and they
adjust
do that sometimes,
Yeah.
especially with like eclipses, that they
Right.
do ask for additional capacity during hours outside of the available assessment hours. But it is with this kind of construct, it is interesting. And I mean, since you're not an RA, you wouldn't be awarded for performance outside the shown hours, then there shouldn't be I guess you could game it somehow if you don't think you'd perform as well in the shown hours as you normally would. I don't know, but
Yeah.
but like what I said before is basically what you're suggesting. So and you would want to bid, and is the expectation basically that you bid at a really low price, so you are likely to get dispatched?
That I think so. Yeah, that's what makes sense to me.
So, we are getting a little in the weeds, and there'll be plenty of opportunity. This isn't going to. We're going to have more opportunity to comment, and we're probably going to also discuss. Maybe when we have more questions with individuals, we'll certainly be available for discussion. I think we put in a 5-minute break. Maybe Eric, I see you have 2 more slides. If we could just go through the slides and then we can come back, we can go on break so people can go to the bathroom or do whatever they need to do. And then we'll have a discussion and we can include those 2 slides. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a break
And
now
Gil,
and then go through these 2 slides, or we could just hammer through them and then we could end the meeting a little early.
Gil, I see you have a question, and we'll put you first in the queue when we start discussing again, and we'll be able to discuss any of these slides. So, yeah, why don't we just take a quick break and we'll come back and then we'll just go through the 2 slides and just we'll continue the discussion. Basically, I don't want to say free for all, but we'll continue the discussion, which can include the whole aspect of it. But let's get back. Let's get back here in about 4:13, and we'll start up again then.
All right. We'll go ahead and start sharing so we can jump right back in whenever we are ready.
Why don't we move to the next slide?
Okay. So the other piece, and are we ready to go?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay. So the other piece that I wanted to share that we've talked a little bit about internally, but I think maybe not everyone on the working group has seen, is this idea of weighting under the BAM-PAM proposal. So I started thinking about this because I was looking at the example that Josh sent out that we sort of did our 2 demonstrations on, and I was looking at its performance relative to the TTM values that Josh had submitted across different prices, and just noticing that this resource kind of didn't perform quite as well as the TTM would have suggested under what looked like the tightest hours and days. But if we applied sort of a straight performance alignment metric, I got 118%. So I was really trying to square, this resource performance that looks like pretty good, but maybe not great under the worst conditions, with a metric that said, this overperformed by 18%. And so I think the solution to that is weighting by LNPs. Again, I'm really sorry for all the numbers on here, but basically what you do is instead of taking the sum of load impacts over the sum of the capability profile, you just start by weighting each of or multiplying each of those by the LNP. So, the capability times the LNP is this number. The load impact times the LNP is this number. And so that just kind of evens out, some of these events that were poor performance at really high LNPs with a very large number of overperforming events under sort of lower price conditions. And so I started there, but also realized that once you do that, it's really easy to compare sort of across, I showed comparing across months, days, and hours, but really it becomes a really good way to compare across, sublaps and aggregations. And I think it's a really flexible way to sort of get an idea of how well a resource or portfolio performed. If you apply these weights, you get 101%. So that's still above, that's still meeting all expectations. This resource would not face any penalties, but it seemed a little bit more reasonable to me than, pretty large overperformance. I think this is really easy to see if you look at the hour 4 dispatches down here. There's only 3 of them, and that's where we had this one event where there was actually negative performance. And the price for that one was, 350. The price for these other 2 events were in the 700s and 800s. And so when you look at the sort of value, this one event where you had, sort of a delta of about 60 from what the TTM value was, is only worth about 17,000, whatever units that is. Whereas each of these other ones at much higher prices were worth a lot more, even though their overperformance wasn't as much as, you know, the underperformance. So if you don't weight those, you get 11% because, you know, this was just huge underperformance, right? Actually going negative. But if you do weight them, it's back up to 50%. Now, of course, then there's the question of, you know, we get these values for each different hour, dispatch hour. And so that is, I think, this illustrates how this is a really nice way to aggregate up, you know, across those different dispatch hours. So even though 3 out of the 4 of these are below 100% on average, because, you know, apparently these are the really important hours, the highest LMPs, performance was still pretty good in this, you know, second hour, that you still get a number above 100%. So I'm feeling optimistic about that. I see 2 hands, but I don't know whose hand went up first.
Well, let me just remind people that this is not necessarily like these are thoughts of ours. These are things we're going to be looking at in the testing period to see if they make them better or worse or other kind of results. So, although we've seen, you know, we have some anecdotal evidence here on one resource, what may happen. We may, you know, we have not come to a conclusion on this, although it's promising. And just like everything else, we're heading into the testing period to kind of check if, you know, what these kind of ideas mean in terms of the data we're seeing. Again, we can't really test how people will act since these have already been acted under different rules. But we will be trying to see, like, is this one scenario that Eric is pointing out here? Is this kind of pointing out something that's a real problem, or is it something that seemed to only happen this one time? And when we get to the real data that we're investigating, maybe we'll find out that we're worrying about nothing. So I just wanted to remind people. And if we you know, we may come to a conclusion, and there'll be certainly time to talk about what the results say as well. So I just wanted to remind people about what the studying period and the testing period is going to entail. Hamid?
Yeah, hi. Just I guess I just wanted to clarify, by weighting by the LMPs, what you're trying to do is for hours in which LMP are higher, which indicates that the resource is needed the most because the grid is most stressed, you're going to basically weight hours of performance based on grid needs. And so if a resource performs better in higher LMPs, then their performance is going to go up more dramatically than if they perform poorly during a non-high LMP hour.
That's exactly right. Thank
Cool.
you.
And then in terms of like process and like where this fits in and how this is at the end of the process, ex post, looking at performance, this is what the performance penalties would be assessed on using this weighting.
Correct. Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, thanks.
David, did you want to say something, or was your hand still up from before? Then Josh.
Yeah, so a couple things. One of them is I'm support this for the PAM metric. Actually, we discussed potentially introducing this really early on, and I think people need to get used to the metric first before it dealt with weights. I also agree pretty strongly, like the right way to do the weighting and kind of weight in aggregate, because overall you kind of have less. The more you aggregate, the more data points you have, and the more you can understand the performance of the resource than applying it by individual hour. The last observation I do have is I do think this should be limited to the performance assessment metric, right? I think like in the bid alignment's a different topic. It's about whether you're making yourself visible at the right times overall. And I do think like it makes perfect sense for the performance alignment metric. I do like the notion of saying, look, you know, bid alignment is basically only measured for the hours that matter the most, which is really probably about the top 2% of hours.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So we in the proposal, we suggested using the weighting for both. Josh is saying, stick with the original proposal of just top 100 or so hours for BAM. Yeah.
For BAM, and for PAM, I think the weighting makes a lot of sense.
Okay, thank you. Noor?
There's, I don't know if contracts would be set up in that way, but the only thing that came to mind when looking at this presentation was what if a contract had a different price for different hours?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I actually, I sort of walked back some aspects of my proposal because I was thinking, it doesn't seem realistic that they will, but if they do, I think this can certainly be flexible enough to do that. Like you would just calculate the PAM for each, hour, right? If you said dispatch hour corresponds to hour ending 18, I would just use this value for hour ending 18 and 19 and so forth.
Yeah, that's fine.
So
And I
that's
presume
more-
these would be hourly, right? This would, I mean, you simplified it here, but this would be the same formula, but it would be done hourly.
Yeah, so take the hourly results, multiply by the weights and then sum everything up and take it. Yeah, is that am I following? I think I saw Eric's hand up next.
Yeah, this is Eric from the CAISO. I think I'm just curious, as we're testing, I'd be curious to see the results of this compared to not averaging high performance and underperformance, and just seeing, although this is a weighted average, it's still an average, and I'd be curious to see what result you'd get if you were just summing total underperformance. But I know that's not part of the PAM as currently designed, but just a thought.
Yes. Got it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Wait, sorry, actually, so are you imagining cutting off each of these at 100%? Is that the idea? Each of the sort of hourly
Yeah.
Okay.
Eric, that's going to create asymmetric noise, which almost always leads to a biased answer. In that case, a bias downward. So whenever you do that kind of cap stuff, what you're basically doing is creating asymmetric noise in the data. And the purpose of the PAM proposals, let's assess the performance, both the over and under. We know that some of these resources are a little bit noisier, right? So in percentage are always the best thing to look at for various reasons. But at the end of the day, right, like the main thing that you want to find out is what is the overall performance that you have if you're weighing things more heavily. I would not cap at the individual hour because you're literally going to create mathematically bias in the results.
Yeah.
And there might be like there's a separate issue, which is the predictability of a resource, right? Because that's not factored into PAM. How predictable is the resource and consistent it is in terms of being predictable, which I think is a valid thing, but I think it's a different metric if you want to have that.
Yeah, I won't go too far down the rabbit hole, but yeah, I understand that. And I think just thinking about incentivizing, resources to be as less noisy as possible.
And that might be like a third metric that we haven't come up with yet, right? But that's like a different issue because I think there is something to be said about having resources that are more predictable. I had a comment. It had more to do with like Nora's earlier comment, Eric, and so I raised my hand. And I was a bit confused there because I think on one hand you said, look, we should assess this not by hour, but overall. And I think there's a distinction that we need to draw because like individual providers may have a contract with a distribution company overall, or a LDC, right, a local distribution company, and they may have or a CCA, and they may have that contract. That contract's between the two of them. I think like the actual measurement of BAM and PAM applies to the resource, and it should be the standard thing all the way through. So I would kind of think like, look, that's a deal that you need to work out between you two. In practice, if you're going to sit here and do the weighting, you should weigh and do the same calculation for everybody, because what you're trying to assess here is the DR qualifying capacity, not the individual contracts that people have between each other. Unless I misunderstood, nor
Isn't the
your comment.
capacity with slice of day, isn't it by hour?
Yeah.
I think what Nora was saying is, if a contract is written where, hour 18 has a capacity price and hour 19 has a capacity price under the slice of day paradigm, will this work for it? And I think the answer is yes. We just stop aggregating once we get to the sort of hourly level, but you can still do it across different resources and whatever.
Yeah, this calculation you can break down into pieces, but I think that would have to be part of the agreement with between the whoever has that contract, right? Because to me, and maybe I'm mixing stuff up, Nora, I'm not 100% sure here, but to me it's like this is just the calculation for the QC. The calculation for how you settle between parties, right, when they have a contract, might be a little bit different. Where you may want to say we want to do it by hour, and if so, you could modify this calculation to do it by hour. Am I properly understanding the topic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess isn't this used for the penalty assessment?
It is, but in the PAM-BAM configurations used overall, right? Because there can be a case, for example, where you don't get called in a given year for hour 4 to 5. So I'm never going to see the 4 to 5 hours. So because the CAISO didn't dispatch you for that, they didn't need you at the time. You may have bid for those hours, but you may not have been called, right? So the key thing that I think is an advantage of the PAM approach as well, I'm looking at your actual performance, right, compared to what we expected given the hours that you bid and the conditions when you bid, according to capability profile. But I don't need to see you dispatch all 5 RA hours every single time. What I need to see is consistent performance according to what you told me you would do.
Yeah, and I mean, this is kind of really just picking nits because I probably not likely that there's going to be a contract that's really that distinguished by hour, but it did come to mind.
Yeah, right. And then I think on the converse, if you do have just one price for this kind of diverse set of months and hours and different capacity values within each of them that reflect the capability profile, that we can handle that too, right? You just keep rolling this this aggregation all the way up to the top. So
yeah, well, I guess different monthly values is quite common. So
yeah, right. So that's all I have on this one. I'll go to the next one, which is a related change. It's just a slight change from kind of what I presented on earlier. There are some questions on how the sort of monthly hourly capacity shortfall penalty would be applied. And I was thinking about exactly this, that like I don't think we're going to have hourly capacity prices. And so, you can use as weights the monthly capacity prices if you have them. I've just input the default for this one, the sort of CPUC approved kind of penalty values for capacity shortfalls. But Nor, to your point, if you had different values by month, you can easily update those and then weight the hours by the number of events. One, because we think those results are going to be more robust. And two, because those hours get called more, they're presumably more important. And so this is sort of the new sort of proposed weighting scheme that hopefully is not as dependent on a certain contract style. That's all I have on this one. Any questions? Should I kick it back to go to next steps?
Uh, yeah, we can go to next steps. I just want to make sure because we kind of, I don't even know if he's still on, but is Gil, did you have? Yeah, I don't know if he's might not be
Oh,
still
yeah.
on, actually.
Bill did have a
Gil, did you have something you wanted to discuss before we go on to the next steps, or has it been answered? Or
Question on slide 9, the bidding, yes. Say we're looking at our ending 19 specifically. The example here shows the market award is 6 megawatts, while the capability is 9 megawatts. For bid alignment assessment purposes, am I measured against 6 or am I measured against 9?
For bid alignment, you'd be measured against 6. Since for hour ending 19, we would assume it's the second hour, and that you'd be bidding, a higher amount in hour ending 18. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, go ahead, Josh.
yeah, for bid alignment, I mean, you can just do it directly based off the day ahead bids, right? There is no requirement to kind of do it based on the true up the day ahead, the real time number. That kind of shows up in the performance. You may still want to do that, right? Because there are penalties from CAISO. But I think like in general, bid alignment's kind of, are you showing the resource and the magnitude of it at the right hours, right? So that's kind of the distinction. And, I haven't talked to Eric in full about this, but, my sense on this is like, let's just make sure people are showing up at the right time. And if they get called, are they really kind of dispatching according to the capability profile? Now, the notice that you give to the CAISO, you may want to go ahead and update the real time, adjust your bid to reflect reality with CAISO. I'm sure they would appreciate it, right? Number one. But number two, that way you ensure you don't have any penalties that come from the CAISO, from the real time market, from the bidding market. So that would be my thought process for it. But to me, it's like, it's simpler in the sense that you can just directly assess, here's the bid alignment. Do your bids align with your resource capability?
In practice, I'm not sure how that is going to work out. The market award is 6 megawatts, although the resource can provide 9 megawatts. So on the day of basis, do I update the Cal ISO and say, hey, I can provide 9 megawatts, although the market award is 6?
Recommended, not required. Right. The way we have it classified, it would be like highly recommended that people do that. It's not absolutely required. And they're the bid alignment metric. And I think it's a topic for discussion, right? Because like if the CPUC comes back and says, look, I really want the bid alignment and real-time market duty trued up, then we'll probably modify it and say, okay, well, you need to actually true up in the real-time market. But in practice, I can calculate the bid alignment just based on the day-ahead bids, right? It will be highly recommended to actually update the bid in the real-time market to reflect your true capability if you're called upon.
Yeah, and
but not required. At least not for the calculation.
Right. You mentioned the PUC, but I think the perspective I'm really curious about here is the CAISO. So I don't know if Eric or anyone else from the CAISO wants to weigh in on that, but I think that is the ultimate goal. Is bids always need to reflect capability. So, Amy.
Also, if the resource can provide 9 megawatts, since our ending 19 is the first hour of the event, for PAM, what am I measured against? 9 megawatts or 6 megawatts?
You're measured against the capability profile. So your capability profile would say, look, I started at hour 19. I have 9 megawatts available.
9, yeah.
Yeah, so it'd be the 9. So like realistically, the performance is what's weighing you in terms of like, are you delivering according to the capability you told us you would have in advance? I'll give you the conditions, right? And the conditions here are you got cold starting hour 19.
Confusion.
Amy? Oh, I'm sorry, Gil, were you still saying something?
Yeah, I was going to say that may cause quite a bit of confusion. Say the resource provider can, dial back, part of the resource by not dispatching all the customers. Since the market award is 6 megawatts, they just provide 6. Though the full capability of the resource can be up to 9.
Mhm.
So this case, they just provide as much as the market award, and
Yeah,
not
but then
providing
but
9. So that
yeah,
may
but then
be
you would
some
dealing
confusion.
on the performance alignment metric. I think the challenge here, Gil. I mean, if you have better thoughts, by all means, you're welcome to kind of share them. The challenge here is how do you reflect the full capability in the bids, right? Because there's no conditional bidding in the CAISO market, so you can't kind of reflect, hey, if I get cold in this hour, I'm going to have decay. Except for saying here's a set of rules for bidding in the day ahead market, and then truing it up in the real time market afterwards, right? So like that's the challenge, right? It's like you really are trying to say we want to have the resource be held accountable to the capability shown for resource adequacy, and at the same time you want it to be reflected in the real time market. You can't do that because there's no conditional bids in the real time market. The only way to do it is to say here's a set rule for bidding day ahead, and you must adjust if you're called upon to tell CAISO what you can really deliver. Now, in practice, right, from a BAM perspective, you could require people to align with the real-time market, or you could just say, look, I'm just going to measure based on what you did in the day ahead market. I know that the performance alignment metric is going to take care of it if you don't really dispatch your full capability.
Yeah, that's a good point. We could implement a similar metric that's like a BAM for the real-time market, right? And so that could be a second sort of phase to go through.
It just complicates things more
currently. Yeah, but
yeah.
It's a possibility. Amy, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Amy Wong from SCE. I know we talked about this probably in a meeting back in September, October. There was maybe talk or consideration of this method. There may be instances or possibilities that whatever comes out of this working group may not apply for RDRRs. So again, in 2022, when we were calling customers and telling them not to operate during that week, we had those flex alerts or grid emergencies, and we had to adjust our bids, our RDRR bids, to account for those customers not being online, right? So it's not going to show up performance data because they were never operating to begin with. That was a personal request or ask of those customers. And so would that ding us here through this mechanism where the performance or, the capability should have been, 400 megawatts, but because we asked 100 megawatts of load to not even come online, and we adjusted our bids, do we get dinged for that?
That's a really good question. I would like to think there's some sort of, or I would hope, there could be some flexibility from the PUC, which might be better able to answer this question, but, acts of God kind of thing, right? Like,
Amy, I have a few thoughts on that, if you don't mind me chiming in. Are you okay with that? Because there's two things that jump out there. Right? One of them is RDR is not going to have to deal with the performance alignment metric, right? Because you're, very much on call. The way you would deal with that from
coming in a little tight again.
The way you would deal with that from the analysis standpoint is you would probably kind of treat like those days as ineligible, or essentially treat them as full event days, right? Because you're basically saying the resource is not going to show up. That's an event day. So you're measuring in the evaluation side, here's my load drop, where I drop down to 0 on those days, overall compared to what would happen in non-event days. So that's probably the way you would tackle it, right? Is to kind of say, look, your load would have been, call it 200 megawatts, you're now at 0. And you're doing that on purpose because we're telling the loads to disappear. So your 24-hour load impacts are 0 across the board because you told them don't even turn on to begin with. But really it kind of boils down to making sure you don't include any of those days that are 0 as being treated as non-event days. You want to treat all those 0 days as being event days. That's sort of like the way you would probably think about it. So it's kind of like an out-of-market event day would be a way to describe it. If that works with KAISO, then you can do the measurement and show that, yeah, we're dropping that load. It's intentional. It's actually a modification to the loads that wouldn't have happened without the program or without some type of out-of-market dispatch.
Can we hear from Eric Lagerquist? KAISO.
My comment was actually on the kind of previous discussion. So David, if you had something on the RDRR point, go ahead.
No, I don't. But we're at 4:43, so I'd like to hear about from you about the previous.
Okay. Yeah. Just to briefly respond to the bidding question. I don't think it will surprise anyone to say that generally the KAISO isn't going to tell you, exactly how to bid, but that we want to see bids that reflect, that accurately reflect a resource's capabilities, and that, the principle of the must offer obligation is that RA capacity is bid into the day-ahead and real-time market to the extent it's able and available. I think the point I wanted to make about the performance alignment metric was, I think it's slightly concerning to see it comparing performance to the capability profile versus the dispatch. It's an incentive to perform kind of not to your dispatch, but to a different number if you haven't, reflected your capability into your bid and been dispatched for it. So I know it only looks at full dispatches, my understanding, but just wanted to make that note.
Yeah, Eric, and the ideal thing would be to have people reflect their bid in their dispatch. Their bids reflect their full capability, right? Because the two should align. Because your capability profile is telling you, here's what I'm capable of, and your bid is telling you, well, here's what I'm capable to as well. And ideally, the two of them should align, right? So I think like the question boils down to, if you get called, do you need to be required to update your bid to reflect your real capability? Because we don't have that conditional option unless you do a day ahead bid and then update it based on in the real time market.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do think we could require it and just add it on to the proposal as written, or we could test a variation of the proposal where there's this sort of additional real-time bid alignment metric that basically says, did you realign this bid with these values? And then the performance alignment metric isn't measured against this, it is measured against the dispatch. Although, there's no guarantee that you'll get a dispatch on what you bid into the real-time market. So I might maybe just keep the performance alignment metric as it is, and that would be sort of a middle ground that says, look, you have to bid it in, but even if you're not dispatched onto it, we'll say that counts as communicating it to the KAISO. It's maybe not ideal, but in between. David?
Well, I was just, I've heard that something about like if you get a day ahead bid and it's 6, then you can't really. It might not be possible to adjust to 9. I'm wondering, does this incent folks to put in the capability profile for 19 through 22, the 10.631 as well, because that's what they have to bid for those hours. That's what they're planning on bidding, and therefore they don't want to find themselves where their capability profile is different from than what their bid is going to be. Because they don't have that flexibility in the CAISO.
And I think like that is a great example of the sort of reasonableness determinations, I think, that we're gonna have to contend with at some point here. Because I think there are some resources that is reasonable for, right? Josh, you mentioned one that like just totally cuts out air conditioning load, right? And so it doesn't matter what time you start that program, it's gonna be pretty much the same, I would imagine. But there's others, if it's a thermostat program, where that's not going to be the case. So,
or batteries. I mean, that's the big one. Is actually the other aspect is like the behind the meter batteries. You know, I think people are working out the dispatch behind them, but they're tend to have that decay factor as well.
So we have about 10 minutes left. So do we want to go on to the next steps, I think?
David, sorry, this is Luke. So there were what was sent out yesterday, or sorry, yesterday, with the draft work plan. I feel like none of that was what we talked about today, so I'm a little bit confused. But I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to ask a question or two about that document.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so with regards to the bid normalized load impact, it looks to me, at least as best as I can figure out, is that the intention is to only count bid quantities for when the bid price is below $600 per megawatt hour. Is that an accurate understanding?
I think above $600 an hour. Is that what I said? Oh, sorry, the bid quantity below 600. Yeah.
So you're forcing I realize this is just a test, but I've expressed my concern about this in the past. So what you're doing is you're doing imposing a backdoor bid cap. I just want to, say again, I don't think this is the right venue to be doing this sort of thing. Obviously, what do you guys look at whatever you want to look at. I realize this is, kind of a study plan here. But I really have strong concerns that this could end up translating in the future into a new bid cap, implicit if not explicit. And so I suspect what you're going to find is that this is purely based on my own theory, is that you're going to see a lot of, maybe among third parties, you might see having to throw out a lot of bid data or bids, but whereas the utilities that probably I assume they tend to bid lower. However, the bids relative to RA values is going to be juxtaposed, and so that's just something I want to put out there. And also I do want to also say that a bid at 601 versus 599, the value is the same and the capacity is the same value. And what we should be looking at is whether or not the capacity is being delivered when it's called upon, regardless of what price that is.
I will say we discussed, and I'm not sure, I don't think it made a mistake, but we did discuss internally about if something was selected, even though it was above 600. And so that will be something. And this is a draft, so certainly, Luke, your comments will be, welcome for the study plan. And, we may still have further thoughts ourselves on how to do this. So I don't know if Eric has a comment on that, but do you have any comment on?
Yeah, I mean, we hear you on your concerns about sort of a backdoor bid cap. This is sort of the only way we really figured out to make this particular proposal work. Maybe that'll just mean the other proposal takes the day. But I think, in terms of the sort of retrospective analysis, we are interested in running a case where we sort of set that price cap to $1,000, or I guess just below $1,000, with the assumption that in the past, that's kind of the price cap that DR providers were working with, and we think that'll be more reflective of future performance than if we did the retrospective analysis, you know, using the proposed price cap.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's no price cap in place in 2022, and so you know, that's not, so there's no opportunity, obviously, for anyone to retroactively change their bids. And so, but also my concern is that going forward, I would not want this to translate going forward as some sort of, again, you know, implicit bid cap, because it could force, if this is adopted permanently, then it could force DR providers and utilities to bid, you know, no higher than $600 in order to count, you know, and to avoid a penalty. And you know, I have to point out that I've seen nothing in this entire process, working group process, to demonstrate why $600 is an appropriate number and not the $949 that's currently, you know, that was most recently adopted by the commission. It seems incredibly arbitrary, and I just, you know, there needs to be some support for that, for it to be anything other than $949 from my perspective. Going forward.
Yeah, I've done a little thinking on this, and I can share something on that. Yeah.
Was that in Alicia? If you can
Good afternoon.
ask your questions quick.
Good afternoon. This is Lizeth Garcia from Mazzini. I just wanted to double check on the first bullet from this slide. It states that you're looking for work plan comments. This is more about how we are working now, or can you please clarify exactly what type of comments are you looking for?
You know, I think it's pretty wide open in terms of what's in the work plan, and even what we discussed a little bit today. But you know, if there's something missing that we've missed, if you know, if there's something that is unclear that you would like to be clarified a little bit more in the draft plan and things like, you know, I would say, you know, we can take comments and we can't, you know, they may or may not end up affecting the final plan, but you know, when you read it and you know, this doesn't sound right, or I don't understand this, or they forgot this, you know, that kind of thing can certainly go in there. Yeah.
And then the second question that I have is that could it be possible to move the due date to the following Monday, like kind of January 8th?
Sure.
I second that. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay, and sorry, the last question that I have is I noticed that there is a meeting on January 28th, but I know that most of the people are kind of are on vacation, so I just want to make sure that when you say no more meetings, that means that the next meeting that is scheduled for December is canceled.
I would say that there should be no more scheduled meetings on your calendar. If there are, either I have failed to cancel them correctly, or they have ended up on your calendar somewhere. But just so everybody knows, and there are no more planned meetings.
No more meetings.
There won't be any more meetings, but there are no more planned meetings or scheduled meetings this time. But there will always clearly be more meetings down the line. So.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, Alicia?
My question goes back to the one I asked at the beginning. The work plan mentioned an appendix, but it did not include said appendix.
We may have taken that out. Sorry, we will. Yeah, why don't we just go through again, clean things up? David, we didn't send out an updated version, did we? Just the original?
No, we didn't. No, we've only sent one version now. We may, in fact, there's a good chance. We had many versions going back and forth a little bit, so we may send out a second draft version.
Yeah, we may have had a version control issue, so we'll make sure we get that updated.
Okay.
I do have a question.
Josh, do you have a Yeah, last
Yeah.
question, Josh.
Yeah, I do have a question. I was trying to understand the work plan because I mean, to me, it's sort of like a description of a revised proposal, and we need to update the figure we talked about. So probably ideally we have that done before the updated draft is sent out. But I'm kind of curious if, from a work plan standpoint, I always think about execution. How are we going to test this? What are we going to test it on? What's the timing of it? And I'm wondering what the thought process is on that front because I did not see that in the work plan. Like if you're going to test this, you'll probably need to develop the capability profiles before the summer, not after the summer, things like that. So I'm kind of curious if it's just designed to be a written document that describes the calculations, or is really designed to kind of say, here's the data we're going to use, here's the timing of when we'll do things, here's the calculations we're going to do, here's what we're going to test. Because my fear is that we'll have a piece of paper here, right? But if you don't enact this, have developed capability profiles, for example, before the summer, then what we're testing is just vacuum testing. It's not a real test.
I don't understand what you mean before the summer.
Capability profiles should be delivered in advance, not after, right? So you're telling people, here's what I can do before you actually have to perform.
Well,
You don't
so I
deliver
think-
capability profiles after you perform. You deliver them before you perform.
Yeah. So I'm hearing two things. One is that we should put some timelines in here. The second is whether this is going to apply to this upcoming summer. I think the answer is we're doing this completely retrospectively. So we have the benefit of hindsight. We have to work with previous LIP reports, right? So if you want to use your previous LIP report, which you developed before the summer of 2022, that's fine. Or if you want to go back and say, if we had the benefit of hindsight, what would we have done and how would that have impacted us? That's fine
So
too.
I think there needs to be a bit more clear in there, right, in the work plan. And like realistically, if you're going to develop I'll set a ground rule, if you're going to develop a capability profile, say you're developing one for 2022, not the best summer in general to do it for. Actually, it's pretty good. It's a hot summer. But I would say, look, you must use data before 2022 to develop the capability profile. You can't use 2022 data to develop the capability profile for 2022. So just simple ground rules like that would be useful, and the timing and just making it clear, here's what we're going to use for testing and how, because I think that's missing in there. It's a lot of descriptions to how you're going to do the calculations, not what data will be used for the calculations or the timing of them or how that will be implemented. And how broad will the test be, quite frankly? Is it going to be a one or two programs where you can get data, or is it going to be across every single program, or a wide mix of programs that we're going to have to, or resources that we want to do the testing on?
Yeah, we'll put some timelines in there, and hopefully that'll clarify some things. But really, it's trying to be open to all who want to do it. So
yeah. All right, and I just want to say that we are all, Daniel, Eric, myself are available. Try to make ourselves available for questions. If you want to meet face to face, virtually, then we're available. This is a pretty open process, hopefully, and to answer questions, or if you have specific concerns, or if you do want to submit a profile and you're not sure about how to do it, we're available. Just reach out to us. Okay. It's 5 o'clock, 5:01. I apologize. I'll be over a minute, and we will talk to you again in the future. Have a nice holiday, everybody. Make sure to take some time off from not thinking about incentive-based QC. Okay. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Happy holidays.
thanks, everyone. Bye.
Sure.